Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my 3-step watercolor painting process for these little whales, which are great for beginners because they're going to help us continue practicing basic techniques and also color mixing and developing a wide variety of values and translucencies so that we can create a sense of dimension in these little whales. Let's go ahead and jump straight in. So the very first thing that you're going to be seeing me work on are my 3 preliminary outline sketches. I like using an HB drawing pencil for my preliminary sketching process when I'm going to be preparing to paint with watercolor, and this is because an HB drawing pencil allows me to go in and sketch pretty lightly. Of course, I'm not pressing down too hard either, and this is because I don't want to see my pencil work through my watercolor paint at the end, and I also want to prevent scratching or damaging my paper in any way. And finally, I also want to be able to refine my drawing as I go and erase my mistakes as I continue working on achieving great shapes for these whales and also great proportions. I wasn't looking at any particular reference photo for any of these whales as I was creating these sketches. I did, however, sit down and do some research on different types of whales because I wanted to challenge myself not only with drawing different kinds of whale shapes and slightly different proportions, but also when it came time to actually painting them, I wanted to make sure to use at least slightly different color combinations in each of them. And so even though I'm drawing these from imagination, I did take time, maybe 20 to 30 minutes, to do some research on different types of whales. I took notes on the anatomy of different types of whales and also what I had to make sure to include in all of these 3 different whales to make them look like the whale that I was actually intending to draw. So with all of this visual information in my head from having done my research and having taken notes, I then went ahead and started drawing these from imagination, and of course they resulted in relatively believable looking whale drawings. Now, the process that I went through to sketch all of these is exactly the same, and I talk all about how the way that I draw one thing is the way that I draw everything in another video that I shared a while back titled How to Draw Anything You Want. I'll make sure to link to it down below in the text section of this tutorial. But essentially, I start from general and I make my way towards specifics. I make sure that not only my shapes and my proportions for those largest shapes look good to me before moving forward to medium-sized shapes and smaller shapes and details, but I also like making sure that since the beginning, by placing those largest shapes first, I am using my drawing space or my painting space wisely, and the entire drawing is actually the size that I need it to be. One thing that I always do is if I am going to be sketching something that I feel is going to be relatively simple for me to draw or sketch right on my watercolor sheet, I go ahead and do that. But whenever I have to draw something that requires very specific proportions or perspective or is just more complex for me, then I go ahead and draw it on a separate sketchbook, and then I use tracing paper to transfer my sketch onto my sheet of watercolor paper. And this is so that I can ensure that I'm not going to be erasing too much on my sheet of watercolor paper, because the more I erase on it, the more chances there are that I'm going to make it muddy, messy, and I'm going to start damaging it. So there's an extra little tip for you there. All right, so I finished up with my preliminary outline sketches, and it was about time to get ready with creating my first color mixtures. The colors that I'm going to be using for these 3 whales are Phthalo blue, Ultramarine blue, neutral tint, burnt sienna light, and yellow ochre. I'm not going to be using all of these in all 3 whales. The color combinations for each are going to be slightly different, and you definitely do not have to use the same colors that I'm going to be using. You can use whatever you have on hand that is similar to what I am using, and your whales are going to turn out great. So I go ahead and prepare 4 different puddles to get started on my color mixing palette. The first little puddle on the left is phthalo blue plus a little bit of neutral tint. The next one to the right of that is ultramarine blue plus burnt sienna. you'll see that I was able to arrive at a gray by mixing together my blue and my brown. When you're creating your gray by mixing together blue and brown, make sure that you have approximately a 50-50 amount of each so that it looks gray. If you have more brown than blue in your mixture, it's gonna look like a dark brown. And if you have more blue than brown in your mixture, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And I prepared that mixture for my orca or my killer whale, which is of course black. And if you're asking yourself, well, why didn't you just go ahead and use the neutral tint or a Payne's gray or a ready-made black for the orca? Well, the reason is because I would much rather prepare my own dark color mixture by creating my own color combination, which there is an infinite amount of recipes that you can use to create your own darks when it comes to using watercolor, which is going to create a very interesting, deep, vibrant black or dark color that you can use for your black elements or very dark darks. And this is oftentimes going to lead to much better results than using ready-made blacks, which tend to be very neutral, very dull, and very flat. Moving on to the right of that, I have a plain phthalo blue with a bit of water in it. And finally, on the far right end, I have a mixture of ultramarine blue and neutral tint. This is by no means all of the paint that I'm going to be using throughout this painting process. I am oftentimes going to be creating more of these colors or slightly shifting my mixtures more towards the black, more towards the blue, more towards the brown by adding in more of one color or another color into the mixture. When we're painting with watercolor, this is a very fluid process. The ratios of your colors in your color mixtures and also the paint to water ratios in your mixtures shift and change as you go throughout the painting process, depending on whether you need more saturated color, whether you need lighter color, or whether you want to alter the color by adding in more of one or another color. Okay, so with my initial color mixtures ready, I go ahead and get started with the first part of this painting process. And just as a reminder, I'm going to be going through the exact same 3 steps for all of these little whales, which is awesome because we get to practice the same process, the same strategy, the same techniques 3 times. Okay, so what I am doing right here is I am using my size 14 round brush to pre-wet everything inside of the whale using clean water. So little by little, I'm taking a little bit of water at a time from my container, bringing it out onto my paper, and gently smoothing my paintbrush bristles over the entire whale shape, pre-wetting everything with clean water, really taking my time with this process until I've arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout the whale. It is super important that you take your time with the pre-wetting process if you want those beautiful wet on wet effects to happen. Because if you just go over everything just one time and you do it very quickly, probably certain sections of your paper are going to start to dry before others, and you're going to have splotchiness and patchiness, and probably not what you want if you want those smooth watercolor transitions to happen. Also make sure that you don't have any puddles anywhere. You want a nice, even, uniform sheen before dropping in your color. With my pre-wetting done, I went ahead and loaded up my paintbrush bristles by swiveling my paintbrush bristles and really pressing that paintbrush down into my phthalo blue plus neutral tint mixture, which is the color that I'm going to be using for this first whale. As you can see, because I took time to pre-wet my paper with clean water, I am being left with these nice diffused out gradients because watercolor is always going to expand into paper that is wet. This said, I am making sure to only drop in a little bit of paint at a time, and if I need to help that paint move out a little bit more smoothly, help those transitions out a little bit more, or I was left with any little textures that I want to soften out, I remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in just with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and just help that paint expand out if I need to. I can also go in and clean up some edges with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush if I need to. My objective with this first part of the painting process, which I would see as that first base wash of color, is really to develop a nice variety of values and translucencies throughout the whale because I want it to have dimension and depth to it. It's not like we're painting the wall of a house and we want to go in with a uniform, even tone all throughout what we're painting. We really want to make use of watercolor's translucency or transparency and bring in the whiteness and the brightness of the paper under that paint to develop a certain sense of dimension in what it is that we're painting. So what I am doing is I'm really dropping in just a bit of color at a time, starting always with the darkest areas that I want to develop, because that way the majority of that saturated pigment is going to stay in those darkest areas and it's going to expand out into lighter value areas until there is a very small amount of pigment reaching those lightest value areas that I want to leave with a ton of bright paper shining through. Once I've developed that nice range of values, if I want to go ahead and drop in more color into darkest value areas, I go ahead and do that a little bit at a time, making sure that my paper is still wet. And by making sure that I'm going in with just a little bit of paint at a time and dropping it into selected areas that I want to darken, I am ensuring that I'm not creating heaviness and flatness. When I'm painting with watercolor, it's always super important for dimension and for glow and for lightness to bring in the paper as part of the piece and play with the medium's translucency. Once I was done with that initial wash and I was happy with the wide variety of values and translucencies that I developed all throughout the whale, meaning I had certain areas that looked very dark and more saturated in terms of that color, other sections which were super, super light where that color was very transparent and that paper was shining through almost completely, and a wide range of midtones in between. Once I was happy with that range and that sense of dimension, I then finished up this initial layering of color by adding in a little texture. And this is just some splattering that I did using water. I dipped my paintbrush in my container of water, remove the excess drippage by gently scraping the bristles along the top of my container, and I am now using my index finger to flick little drops of water on this paint that is still wet. If your paint has already dried, then the splattering effect is not going to work. Your paint still needs to be wet for this to happen. Essentially, these little drops of water get splattered on that paint that is in the drying process. It disturbs that paint that is drying and it creates these little blooms that create this visual texture. I also want to mention here that if your paint is super, super wet, it's likely that you're going to create these splatters, and since the paint is still moving so much, they are going to disappear. So if that happens to you, just wait a little bit longer so that that paint is not that wet, and then try again. Also remember, when it comes to that kind of texture technique, a little bit goes a long way. All right, so once I was done with that first swale, it was time to allow that to dry. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be working on the first phase in all of these wells. And when I'm done with the first phase in all of these, I'm going to come back to the first one and do the next part of the process. And I'll do the second part of the process for all of them, and then the third part of the process through all of them. This way we can give our different layers a chance to dry, which is always very, very important when painting with watercolor. Before getting started with my pre-wetting for this second whale, I made sure to change my water. You want to make sure that your water is nice and clean when you're doing that pre-wetting. And just like what I did with the first one, I took my time when I was doing that pre-wetting process until I arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout the whale. I'm using the same round brush for this one, my size 14. And the color mixer that I'm using for this whale is my Ultramarine blue plus neutral tint color mixture. So you can see how this looks like a very almost grayed out dark deep blue. And just like what I did with the first one, I am making sure to place just a small amount of paint at a time, starting with the darkest areas that I'm going to be developing and allowing that paint to expand out into lighter value areas. Again, because everything is wet, I was left with nice soft transitions and gradients in which this saturated color turns into lighter and lighter color, and I have certain areas in which that paper is shining through completely unpainted. I'm making sure to drop in just a small amount of paint at a time, and after I've developed a nice variety of values and translucencies, I then go ahead and drop in even more color, once again starting with darkest dark areas. Right here you're seeing me go in with just a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. I am helping that paint move around a tiny bit more, getting it just the way that I want it, and also cleaning up some edges. When you're going into paper that is wet or paint that is wet, you want to make sure that you're not going in with way too much water in your paintbrush, because this can create backruns. And right here, I added a little bit more of that neutral tint into this color mixture to get it very, very dark. And I'm going in with some final depositing of color in darkest dark areas. You can get an idea of how by using a color mixture that has two different colors in it, I'm able to add in more of the darker color to darken it even further, and then use this alternate darker version of that same combination of colors only in darkest areas that I'm looking to really deepen and darken. And this makes it so that I don't only have a wide variety of values, meaning lights to darks, but also a variety in hue, because the color is different. In certain areas. In certain areas, it looks more blue, and in other areas, it looks more like a darker grayish blue, almost black looking color. And this also helps make things look more realistic. Something that I love about taking time to do my pre-wetting before starting with my painting process is that not only is that water content that I have prepared my paper with helping me create soft transitions and does half of the work for me in terms of creating gradients from lights to darks and helping me merge different colors together, but also it expands my working time that I have available. So if you've been working with this medium for any amount of time, then you're probably already well aware that when your paper starts drying, you shouldn't be doing much work at all, because you're only going to be left with splotchiness and undesired effects. And by pre-wetting your paper, you're expanding your working time. You're giving yourself more time to continue working on that color, darkening certain areas and lifting up color if you want to lighten certain areas, and so on and so forth. Whereas if I had started painting on dry paper, that paper starts absorbing and soaking up that paint immediately because it's so thirsty. And sometimes you feel like you're racing against the clock. By this point in the process, the entire whale shape is still pretty wet and workable. And this wouldn't be the case if I had started painting on dry paper. This said, usually when I paint, I use a combo of wet on wet and wet on dry techniques, and we are going to be bringing in wet on dry in the second part of this process. All right, so right here what I am doing is I am creating a little puddle of yellow ochre, because I'm going to be dropping in a tiny bit of this yellow ochre in the underneath portion of the whale, just in certain sections. This helps me bring in a bit of a warmer hue in this underneath part of the whale, and at the same time develop somewhat of a variety of values in this underneath part of the whale, which is so important in order to round out that body. All right, and finally, before everything dries, I go ahead and do a little bit of splattering using water to create a little bit of texture. Remember to remove the excess drippage of water by gently scraping the bristles along the top of your container before bringing your paintbrush out into your painting and doing your splattering, because you want to stay on top of water control. And throughout this entire process, I've been helping myself with my absorbent towel. I also, along the way, constantly touch the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel to remove any excess beads of water on the bristles or even on the ferrule of the brush. I always have my absorbent towel on hand when I'm painting with watercolor. All right, so it was time to allow that initial layering of color in that second whale to dry, and I am now working on the orca, or the killer whale. So what you're gonna notice about this one is that I actually only pre-wet the black portion of the whale. I do pre-wet that white shape right behind the whale's eye, and you can certainly just leave that white spot behind the eye completely dry if you're afraid that too much paint is going to expand into that area and it's not going to look white at the end. I just make sure to not directly deposit any color very close to that white spot, and I will be doing some lifting to remove any excess pigment that gets into that area before the paint dries. But again, you can decide to just leave it dry, and that way you can have more control and make sure that that white spot is actually going to be left completely without any color in it. Okay, so after I did my pre-wetting and I had arrived at a nice even sheen all throughout this black portion of the whale, I go ahead and start dropping in my color just like what I did with the first two whales. And the color mixer that I am using for this orca is my ultramarine blue plus my burnt sienna light. So you can see how it looks pretty gray because I have a almost 50-50 amount of my blue and my brown. This said, because this is a color combination and because of the qualities, especially of the ultramarine blue, you can see a little bit of a color separation taking place, where the color looks a little bit more brown in certain areas and more black or dark gray in other areas, which I think is very, very cool and adds dimension into the whale. Now, as I move along, adding in a little bit more color at a time, I sometimes add in more ultramarine blue into my mixture, and sometimes I add in a little bit of brown into my mixture to manually alter the color temperature and the hue in the color that I am placing. And this also, once again, just like with the previous whale, I am developing a wide range of values, but I'm also developing different hues throughout the whale as well. My objective, as with the past whales, is to have certain areas in which my color is deeper, darker, and more saturated, and other areas in which the paper is shining through almost completely, and a wide range of values and translucencies in between. Okay, so right here I'm doing a little bit of lifting in this white spot in the eye, as you can see, cleaning up that edge of the eye a little bit more. I'll be working more on that definition later with my second layer of paint or my second phase of this process. So I'm not worrying too much about that area, and I'm just gonna go ahead and paint in this furthest away thin opposite to us wet on dry, because this is a relatively small shape and I can paint it in pretty quickly. So as you can see, I go ahead and paint in a pretty translucent version of this grayish color, and then with that initial layer in there still wet, I go ahead and drop in a little bit more color into darker sections that I'm looking to darken even more. And then I just take a quick second to deepen and darken other sections in the black portion of the whale. So for this killer whale, I am approaching painting the top part and the belly or the bottom part of the whale separately, because this particular whale has two very distinct and visually separate parts of its body in terms of the color that it has. So this is why I decided to approach these separate sections separately, as separate parts. However, it is important to develop at least somewhat of a range of values in the white or the bottom portion of the whale, because otherwise it's going to be left flat and that's not going to look very realistic. And so what I did was I added more of that burnt sienna light into this mixture until I arrived at a grayish brown color. And you can see how I'm using this grayish brown in a very, very watered down translucent state, so that this area of the whale can still look white. So you can see how I am using this grayish brown in a pretty translucent state, and I'm adding it primarily into shadow sections right under the fin, or where I want to round out that body a little bit more, and I'm leaving plenty of that white paper shining through unpainted so that this can still look like a white section, which is so important and so distinctive for this type of whale. Now this bottom part I am painting on dry paper because I'm really just looking to paint certain shadow shapes, small shadow shapes. Because I am painting on dry paper, of course, I am left with sharp defined edges around the shapes that I am painting in. So if I want to go ahead and soften some of those edges, all I do is I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles by swiveling my paintbrush into my container of water. I go in with just a tiny small amount of water in my paintbrush bristles and run those bristles gently along those edges to soften them. Because there was somewhat of a color separation happening because of the ultramarine blue, I didn't do as much splattering in this well like I did with the last two. But I did do a little bit of splattering right after I finished with the black part of the whale. All right, you guys, it is time to move on to the second phase of this process for all of these three whales. So I am switching on over to my size 6 round brush. I changed my water because I wanted to make sure that I had nice and clean water in my container. And the objective with the second phase of this process for all of these is going to be to deepen and darken certain shadow areas with abstract irregular shapes in the same color that we were using for the whale on hand. And we're also going to be adding in the eyes. The process for this phase is exactly the same with all three whales. We're using the same color that you were using initially for the first wash, for the first layering that we did for that specific whale. I would make sure to go in with your color in a pretty translucent state initially, and then if you want to darken certain areas within that, you can go ahead and drop in more color while that initial shape is still wet. Now we're going to be doing this on dry paper, so you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around the shadow shapes that you paint in. But again, you can remove that color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in with just a small amount of water in your paintbrush, run those bristles over the edge, and that's going to soften the edge. It's not necessary to soften out all of the edges though, and I would make sure to go in quite minimally so that you don't start overworking your piece. It's perfectly okay to integrate defined edges around some of your shapes or sections of defined edges around some of your shapes and create a combination between soft gradients and sharp defined edges. I think it looks pretty cool and it creates a nice visual balance. So what I have in mind when I am doing all of this is I am primarily thinking of darkening shadow sections. I am creating these illustrations from imagination, again, not looking at any specific reference photo, but I am bringing to mind the general structure of the whale's body, where shadow sections would be created underneath the fin, behind the fin, and just in bottom planes or side planes where the light wouldn't be able to reach as much. And that's where I'm looking to go in with abstract irregular shapes and just pushing darker areas. And that's where I'm looking to go in with abstract irregular shapes to darken certain areas. As you can see, I'm not really looking to deepen and darken or do any layering of color in lighter value sections, lighter midtones and lightest lights, where I develop that initial layering of color in. I want all of those colors and those values to be left alone, not covered up with any more paint. For this second whale, I am going in and adding some elongated shapes, or I guess you could see these as lines that I am painting in for this bottom part of the whale under its mouth and also in its belly. This is the bluish gray that I was using for its body, by the way, but you can see how I'm using it in a very translucent state. I even made sure to test out this color mixture on my scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that I wasn't going in too deep or saturated, because I want to make sure not to go in super dark and saturated on top of a very light value, because that is going to create a lot of contrast and it's going to lead to very stark looking results. I would much rather go in lighter and more translucent and darken certain sections on top of that, so that I end up with a more subtle effect. Otherwise, it's going to look a lot more cartoony than what I would like. You can see how for many of these final details, like the eye and these lines in the belly of this whale, it's so important to add them in on paper that is dry, because you actually want them more defined. You don't want these details to blur out and bleed out into wetness. All right, and finally, In terms of this second phase with the killer whale, I am going in with the same color mixer that I was using for this one, which was the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna light. And you can see how I am going in with my size 6 brush, and I am defining the edges around that white shape right behind the eye a little bit more, which were pretty blurred out because I had pre-wetted that section and the pigment slightly merged into that area a little bit. And then after doing that, I'm also deepening and darkening certain shadow shapes all throughout the black portion of its body. Watercolor tends to lighten as it dries. It doesn't look as dark as it looks when it was first wet. And so with this particular whale, I do find that I go in a little bit more and create more kind of glazing so that I can deepen and darken more of it, get it a little bit darker because this whale is black. I am still not looking to cover up lightest value sections because I still want to play with the translucency of my color and bring in the brightness of the paper underneath. But I do go in with more glazing in darker mid-tone sections and of course darkest dark sections. And with glazing, all this means is I am going in on top of paint that is dry with a second layer of color and applying this color in relatively translucent state. I am not going in super dark or saturated. I'm just overlapping that color, and this in and of itself is going to make that color look darker. And then if I want to deepen and darken smaller shapes within that, I go ahead and drop in more of this color only into certain areas of that larger shape. Okay, so in terms of how I painted the eye, I just went in very loosely and very minimally to add in a little eye. And this is the case for all of these whales. Getting ideas from what I saw in those reference photos that I collected in the beginning of this process. More so taking into account the size, the shape, and the location of these eyes that I saw in those reference photos that I collected in the planning and research phase of this process. But I'm not being super precise or anything, and I know that in a bit I'm going to be bringing in a tiny bit of white gouache to add in some little highlights in the eyes. Okay, so because we did that last part of the process wet on dry, everything dried pretty fast, and with everything dry, it was time to get started with the very last phase of this painting process for these 3 whale illustrations. And this part of the process is completely optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. If you don't have white gouache on hand, you can simply add in some little highlights in your eyes with a white paint pen or something like that. But what I do at the end to add in some final visual texture and maybe even some slight bubble or water effects over these whales is I go in with some permanent white gouache. This is from Winsor & Newton. And I use a cheap size 8 round brush and a small size 2 round brush that I use for my gouache to do some final fine splattering over these whales and also add a tiny bit of highlights into those eyes. The splattering I do with my larger, cheap, beat up size 8 round brush, and of course the highlights I do with my smaller size 2 round brush. When it comes to doing splattering with white gouache, if you've ever used gouache before, you probably are well aware that it is pretty thick in consistency straight out of the tube. So I like modifying the consistency of my gouache on a separate little palette that I use for my gouache. I add in a few drops of water, swivel my paintbrush in my gouache until I think I've arrived at a pretty good consistency, not too runny and not too dry or thick. And then I go ahead and load up a little bit of that paint in my paintbrush bristles and do my splattering very similarly to how I did my splattering with the water before, using my index finger. If you've never done splattering before, or maybe you're afraid that the consistency of your gouache is not good, I would recommend testing out your splattering on a scrap piece of paper. It doesn't even have to be watercolor paper. It can be any type of paper. Test out your splattering technique in there to make sure that your paintbrush and the consistency of your gouache is right so that you arrive at a nice fine splattering. I wouldn't want you to ruin your whales, so be careful with that. Do some tests if you need to. Once again, with the splattering, a little bit goes a long way. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. Alright, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!